Hello, dear class. I know what you're thinking. I will shave at some point, probably soon. This lesson is going to be on mostly on cultural relativism. We'll talk a little bit about methods in anthropological fieldwork. But mostly I want to focus on cultural relativism and also the distinction between cultural relativism and moral relativism, which a lot of people confuse, understandably, because sometimes it's not explained appropriately. So let's start with a little bit of method and theory, just a very little bit. So I want to define the terms ETIC and EMIC. I'm not sure if they were originally linguistic terms. They're definitely sort of esoteric outside the world of anthropology and maybe a couple other social sciences. But essentially, ETIC is a perspective from outside of a group or a culture or some kind of situation. You know, when you're on the outside looking in, so you can kind of observe dispassionately and you can see some things going on and you can maybe describe relationships between objects, between people. You can describe a sequence of events, but you might not have full understanding of what's going on internally, what the motivations of people are, how people are thinking or feeling. And I don't know if you saw that. My dog came in. He's interested apparently in this lecture. But there you go. Basically, we all have an ETIC perspective sometimes on things. Anytime you've been a tourist, whether it's in a different city, a different state, a different country, you have sort of even within your city, right? It could be from one community to another. You come into the picture with your own history, your own experiences, your own set of assumptions, and those might not be the same that people have in the area that you are visiting or observing. Okay, so that's an ETIC perspective. An EMIC perspective is the inside perspective. It's the internal perspective of what's going on. So if you want to remember the difference between these, I'm sure there are better ways to do it, but one thing that helps me sometimes is a stupid mnemonic where EMIC is inside and ETIC is outside. I don't know. The ETIC thing doesn't really rhyme, but EMIC inside, like inside. Okay, I know it's kind of trite, but so why do we talk about these in anthropology? Well, obviously, cultural anthropologists, when they are researching a culture that is not their own, which is most often the case, but not nowadays. That's not strictly the case. There is a lot more of sort of turning the lens on yourself. But when you're researching a culture or a community or a group outside of your own, obviously you are bringing in your own baggage, positive and negative, to that situation, right? Now, on the one hand, that means that you can't fully appreciate what the perspective of people in that cultural group or community is. You can't fully appreciate it. It's like if you move to a country, let's say you move to a foreign country when you're 20 years old and you live there for the rest of your life. The longer you live there, the more you really understand kind of the EMIC perspective, but you still carry with you the knowledge of what it was like to be from somewhere else and to have a different perspective. Again, I bring in my sort of research into this just for the sake of explanations and examples. I did my dissertation research in Poland, and I talked to various people I met there, friends and stuff, and sometimes we would get into conversations about differences between societies and current events and politics and things like this. And one thing some of my friends had a difficult time understanding was the relationship that Americans have with guns. Now, whatever kind of side, I hate to break things down into binaries, but whatever your perspective is on that issue, if you come from somewhere outside, say, for example, in Europe, where they have fairly strict gun laws in a lot of places, and they don't have a Second Amendment, it's hard for them to understand why this is such a big issue in the United States, right? Because they're coming to it with their own perspective. That's not to say everybody thinks the same thing. But if you go to another country, you have the same kind of experience. You don't always understand why they do what they do because you have your own personal experience. And even if you live there for a long time, you still kind of remember what it was like to be from this other place, to think this other thing, and you might still think that thing. Okay? So now, so on the downside, with an ETIC perspective, you can never fully understand what it's like to be completely enveloped in this other perspective, right? However, what you can do is see the forest through the trees, meaning when you're embedded in your own culture, you have a difficult time appreciating that things you do might be different than things people do elsewhere. And if you're trying to explain your perspective to somebody from another society, you might leave a lot of things out because you don't know. There are certain things you take for granted, right? As in, this is just how everybody sees things. There are certain things you might not think to explain. There are certain things you might not know how to explain. If you speak English, then you probably, whether or not English is your first language, you had to take some English, right? And so even those of us who grew up speaking English as a first language, as a home language, we still don't always understand why we say the things that we say. My significant other is Polish, and I have learned some Polish, and she knows English very well. And so, it's interesting talking about the languages back and forth. But when I have to explain something to her about English, I don't always know how to explain it. For example, in Polish and other Slavic languages, they have no definite or indefinite articles. There's no and the. So how do you explain at what points you have to say at what points you have to say the? Sometimes you can reason through it. Sometimes you might remember a rule, but then other times all you can say is, I don't know, you just do. That's the way it is, you just do. Now, linguists can sometimes step back and they can analyze and they can look for patterns, and they can say, well, this is more or less a rule, a grammatical rule in this language. But where that rule came from, why that rule exists, why you have to use that even if you can understand what someone says without it, those are all difficult questions. And the bottom line is, we speak the way we speak because we have learned from people around us how to speak, and we're always learning how to speak, okay? So that is an EMIC perspective on our own language. So the benefit of an EMIC perspective is you know very well what it feels like to be inside this culture, this community, this group. You have the perspective. Sometimes you know why you do what you do, or that at the very least you know a history behind certain things. The downside is there's so much you take for granted, and there's certain things you can't explain. Can you explain why, for example, we have as many words for colors as we do and not more and not less, because there are other cultures that have more or that have less in certain areas. And there's an external reality out there, right? There's a physics to color in the sense that there's different wavelengths of light, and there's visible light, and there's infrared light, and there's radio waves, and there's microwaves. But humans can see visible light, and our brains interpret these wavelengths as different colors. Okay. Now, humans are 99.9% the same at the genetic level all across the world. So it's not so much that the internal machinery differs from one person to another or one society to another, but sometimes our experiences, our cultures, our histories shape the way that we interpret the outside world. And some of that stuff you don't know until someone else has a different opinion. And then you say, oh, whoa, I just thought everybody thought like me. Okay. So that was a very long-winded way of trying to explain ETIC and EMIC and how there are benefits to each perspective and there's drawbacks to each perspective in terms of their explanatory power. Now, an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, the main sort of method that they use in their fieldwork is participant observation, which is a way of trying to blend the ETIC and the EMIC. If you are studying a culture different than your own or a perspective different than your own, you're never going to 100% have the exact same frame of mind as people who have been immersed in that perspective and that culture for their entire lives, right? You're always carrying with you your understanding as an outsider, right? So you might see things in another society that people within that society don't see or that take for granted, right? So on the one hand, that helps you to be objective, quote unquote, right? It helps you to have a perspective that's stepped back and you can sort of compare. It allows you to compare one perspective to another, one society to another. But so that's sort of the observation part of participant observation. But participant means that you put yourself within that community. It doesn't mean that you necessarily believe everything that they believe, or you do absolutely everything that they do. But if you want to understand something, you have to experience it, right? So it means learning the language. It means living with people. It means participating in some of the rituals or pastimes or subsistence activities that they do in that society, so that you can see all of these different aspects of life. You can understand the history, and you can see some things from their perspective and not just your own perspective. Okay, so that's participant observation. That's what cultural anthropologists do. So that sort of brings us to this article that you were supposed to read. If you haven't, by the time you watch this lecture video, I still think you should read it afterwards, because it's enlightening, it's interesting, and I guess I'll just come right out with it. It's a satire. Okay, it's called Body Ritual Among the NACIREMA. And yes, this was published in an anthropological journal in 1956, written by an anthropologist. So if you read this, you know the people are called the NACIREMA, which, who's ever heard of that? It already sounds kind of mysterious and foreign and strange, right? And it talks in very vague terms about where these people are located, between the Yaqui and the Tarahumare of Mexico and the Canadian Cree and this, that, and this, that. And most of the time when we're reading these things, if you're not familiar with the geography or you're not familiar with the specific names of ethnic groups, then you just sort of glaze over and you're just reading the words and you're not thinking about it. But if you were to sort of look at a map, you would realize that this is a very clever way of of framing a territory that happens to correspond to America, okay, the United States of America. So NACIREMA is American backwards, okay? Oh, very clever. Now, once you are clued into that, a lot of the other strange words become intelligible. They talk about the great culture hero Notknisaw, which sounds like, again, a foreign word, a strange word, must be like an indigenous language that only a small number of people know or something. Well, that's Washington backwards. Okay, so they're talking about George Washington. They're talking about the founding story of the United States. The chopping down a cherry tree, I cannot tell a lie, yada yada. They talk about going to see medicine men at the Latipso, which is hospital without the H backwards. This whole thing is an allegory about American culture in the 1950s, because again, this was written in the 1950s, right? And so what is the point of the article? Other than, oh, it's clever, some people don't realize that it's about Americans, yada, yada. There's several points, and there's more than I'm listing here. You probably have noticed something that I haven't noticed. First thing is that certain mundane aspects of life that make very perfect sense to us might seem like black magic or something completely irrational to an outsider. So from the ETIC perspective, things that we do in our own society might seem strange. So in this article, they describe rituals that are prescribed by the holy mouth men, aka dentists, where you take a bundle of hog hairs, which in this case is a toothbrush, and you move it in prescribed motions and in circular motions in your mouth with a magical paste or a magical powder on it. And you do this, a couple of times a day, every day, this kind of thing. And the person explains it. Well, it doesn't really explain it. The person just states, this is what I saw, but in language that obscures what it's really about. It just sounds insane and irrational. And it gives you an impression right away of this other culture as being so mysterious and so unenlightened. The author also talks about women like once a month or something baking their heads in an oven. Well, again, this is the 1950s, and he's talking about people going to get perms, with the hair dryer, like this woman in the picture that you see here. Another point is that the language that anthropologists and others use to describe culture or another perspective is powerful. I mean, and this goes beyond anthropology. If you read, articles in articles, or you watch videos from different news outlets or different websites on different ends of the political spectrum, you're going to see on sort of extremes, you're going to see language that gives you an impression of the other side as sort of, again, unhinged and incomprehensible. And that happens on both sides and other sides, however many sides there are, right? So language is powerful, especially when you're talking to people kind of your own persuasion about some other group. So in the NACIREMA, I counted, and I could be off by a little bit. The last time I counted, that the word ritual is used about 15 times, not including in the title. Now, ritual is a legitimate word, but it tends to give people the impression that it has no rational purpose, that a ritual is something that you just mindlessly follow like a robot, and it's magical and there's no rhyme or reason behind why you do it, and and that's just not an accurate way of describing everything. So ritual is, instead of explaining what might be going on or what the purpose is, ritual is kind of used to tell the readers that I don't know what this is about, but they do this thing all the time. Also, the word exotic, we all know at this point that that's kind of an overused word in our society when we're talking about something unfamiliar, especially when it's something unfamiliar that comes from sort of a tropical region and usually a more poor region. We call it exotic, like it's so foreign to our way of life, and that creates a distance right there. Like, oh my gosh, it's so different that it's almost impossible to understand. You could put it on a pedestal and say, oh, isn't that exotic? Or you could kind of, it could also indicate that it's, again, sort of irrational and almost like unevolved. Like, oh, it's very exotic. Magical, similar kind of thing. Ancient and secret. Traditional. They also use sadistic and masochistic to describe some of these things, like going to the dentist and what's done at the dentist. In no way decreases people's faith. I forget exactly what passage that was in, but again, it portrays the people that this article is talking about, which again is Americans, as irrational and robotic. So that brings up a couple of key terms here. Ethnocentrism, I'm sure you've heard before. It's the opinion that one's own way of life is natural or correct, and indeed the only true way of being fully human. Now, obviously, we all believe what we believe, in part because we think that's correct. Otherwise, we would believe something else. Or maybe we just haven't questioned it, but we trust the source where our beliefs come from. Okay? It's sort of inescapable to believe that you're correct about something. But to be so unreflective as to think, well, there could be multiple perspectives on this, and I could be wrong, or maybe I should try to understand this other perspective before I judge it so harshly. That's kind of a different approach, right? So ethnocentrism is saying basically, like, let's take food for example. Let's say, okay, those of you, I know that, you look at me and, basically you see, you're kind of run-of-the-mill white guy probably, and you're not incorrect, I suppose. But those of you who have ever been in the minority in one way or another probably, can identify with feeling like people in the majority at some point have judged something you're familiar with as strange. So, for example, one of my ex-girlfriends, should I say that on video? I'm not sure. Is, because she still exists, Filipino American, and her I had heard of balut. If you haven't heard of balut, you can look it up, but it's basically a duck egg, I believe, that is a fertilized duck egg. That's like a snack. that you eat. And so I had heard of this, and in American culture, I don't know if any of you guys remember Fear Factor. You can look that up too. Some of you folks may know Joe Rogan as the MMA guy and the dude with the cool podcast and everything, but he used to be the host of a TV show, like a game show called Fear Factor. And I'm pretty sure in one of the Fear Factors, someone ate balut, or, some of the Fear Factors were like, let's have Americans, Americans, quote unquote, which probably meant mostly white Americans, try some exotic, crazy food from somewhere else and, watch how they react and see if they throw up or something. But anyway, so I had heard of balut, of course. And my ex's dad really was quite fond of it and said that when he was a college student, they used to sort of eat this as a late night study snack. And so he brought some over once. And my girlfriend, by the way, ex-girlfriend, right, but girlfriend at the time, she was not really a fan. She liked the soup, as she called it, which is the juices inside, which I agree was quite tasty. But anyway, you open it up, you put some salt in there, you sort of like drink out the juices. Then there's, like a fetus duck, and then there's some other stuff inside. And anyway, so when you are approached with something that is unfamiliar to you, as that is to a lot of people in the U.S., although not all people in the U.S., right? You can say unequivocally, like, that is disgusting. Like, that's just wrong. So you are judging that by your frame of reference, unreflectively, right? I'm right, you're wrong. Period, end of story. Without understanding that your tastes were actually shaped by the experiences you had, the culture you grew up in, what you were taught was good to eat and what wasn't good to eat. And their experiences were similarly shaped in their own culture and experiences, right? And although that may not appeal to you, that may seem gross to you, it's not objectively gross, Those of you who aren't vegan, we're eating muscles of animals all the time. And then there's also coloring agents in our foods that are made in part from crushed insect exoskeletons and things like this. So there's a hypocrisy to that line of thinking, and that's ethnocentrism. By the way, I like the balut. I can't say that I didn't like the mouthfeel of the little duck fetus, and that wasn't my favorite part personally, but the juice part was pretty good. So there you go. So now, cultural relativism, or sometimes I might say cultural relativity, means understanding another culture in its own terms sympathetically enough so that the culture appears to be a coherent and meaningful design for living. Okay, let's unpack that. Again, what it means is, let's take this balut example, right? You say to yourself, first of all, you could say, well, probably some of the things that I eat seem weird to other people, right? If you're not a vegan and you have vegan friends, they probably think the fact that you're eating eggs, fertilized or otherwise, is pretty gross. The literal milk, breast milk, essentially, of a cow, you might be drinking, that could be gross. Again, there's just a lot of things that we don't really think of that other people could consider strange or unappealing, right? So first you have to realize that your tastes are not universal. So where did you get them from? For the most part, it's not your biology. For the most part, it has to do with how you were raised, what you tried growing up, what you didn't try, what your parents told you to stay away from, what your friends said was good. You know, all of these things feed into what we think is good to eat, what we don't think is good to eat. No human culture eats absolutely everything that they possibly could eat. So we choose culturally, maybe not consciously, but each culture has this kind of range of foods that are considered to be good to eat and others that are considered to be gross. Okay? So cultural relativism is a tool, is an approach that anthropologists and others use to try to understand the perspective of another culture. Okay? So we're not necessarily talking about the perspective of another person per se. We're talking about another culture. So if there's a big, group of people who engages in a certain practice that you find strange or distasteful or unnatural or something like that, cultural relativism is a tool that we use to understand that says, stop, take a breath, put your immediate reaction aside for a second, and try to understand. Maybe ask questions. Maybe spend some time with people. Maybe try this food a few times. Maybe understand the ecology. Why would this food be revered or accepted more in one place than another, right? For example, a lot of East and Southeast Asian cultures do not drink milk. And there are ecological reasons for that. It's because animals that, like large mammals that produce milk, were not used for dairying. So there isn't a long history of dairying. And as a consequence of that, there's a lot of lactose intolerance, which is actually the natural state biologically of humanity, and the majority of humanity today is lactose intolerant, which we can talk about later on. But there are ecological reasons for this. It is not necessary to drink milk. Believe me, it's not. So cultural relativism is a tool that is used to understand. It's not the same thing as saying you agree with everything, or you like it just as much as they do, or it's not saying that that all practices are equally as ethical, or because that's sort of a judgment call. What it's saying is, rather than see something unknown and immediately judge it relative to you, you should judge it relative to the rest of that culture. You should understand how the culture functions as a package. Okay. I know I'm rambling, but let me give you one more extreme example. And I know this isn't as relevant anymore as it was a few years ago, but ISIS. Now, ISIS is not exactly a culture. I mean, I guess it's sort of a subculture. I maybe for the sake of this example, I shouldn't be elevating it to a culture. But let's just take the phenomenon of ISIS, right? There's there's one perspective which I'm going to is kind of parallel to ethnocentrism, although it's not quite the same thing. But there's one perspective that immediately says evil, that's evil, and this is good, right? We are good. That's just a group of evil people, and the only way to deal with evil people who almost by definition are just inherently evil, just there's no way that they can change. They must be possessed by the devil or something. The only thing you can do with evil people is destroy them, is kill them, is bomb them, or lock them up forever, because they'll never change, right? So that's one way of dealing with it. And that's kind of like saying a person has cancer. So what we're going to do is we're going to find that main tumor and we're just going to cut it out. That's a good start. But what if the cancer is spread? What if it's metastasized? What about radiation? What about chemotherapy? Yeah. The other approach is to say, okay, some of the people in ISIS may surely be sociopathic. They may be sadistic. But it's pretty hard to believe that there's an organization of thousands of people that have come from around the world that has only managed to attract the world's clinical psychopaths, right? So if you want to understand, that doesn't mean you condone. That doesn't mean you say this is good. This is just as good as what we do over here. No. It says you have this reaction of this is awful. This is terrible. Okay. Now put that aside for a second and try to look at the factors behind why this is the way it is, right? Who are the people who joined? Because, it's not, for example, are all Muslims part of ISIS? No. Is every member of ISIS someone who was raised Muslim? No. Is every member of ISIS male? No. So it's looking at what do they have in common? What do they not have in common? What is the historical moment in which this was created? What are the factors that led up to it? How does it spread? How have they convinced themselves that what they're doing is necessary? Okay, so that's trying to understand so that, in this case, you can find a way to prevent it from spreading and to prevent similar things from starting again, rather than simply cut it out and say, nothing can be done with these people, they're evil, they're spawns of Satan, let's bomb them, and that's that. We know that, for example, terrorist movements continue to pop up in different places, right, at different times, all over the world, for various reasons. So the only thing that helps us to move forward is an attempt to understand the circumstances in which they come about and why. Okay, so that's an extreme example, and I don't want you to confuse that with something like trying to understand different types of marriage around the world, okay? But it illustrates the point that you can have a reaction to a practice that you disagree with. But if you want to understand it, simply judging it from your point of reference, saying that is evil and incomprehensible or disgusting, it doesn't help advance understanding, right? So an anthropologist who goes in and wants to understand and describe another culture uses this tool of cultural relativism, which allows them to watch, to listen, to talk to people, to spend time learning the history, to try and understand how certain perspectives fit together within a culture and how people can make sense out of the world collectively. Okay? I hope that makes some sense. So here's another example that you may have seen. This is like a cartoon that's been around for quite a while at this point. But here are two people from two different, at least religious backgrounds, perhaps two different societies, they're bringing two different cultural assumptions, two different histories to this picture. And in this case, they both have an ethnocentric point of view. Okay, so the blonde woman on the left in the bikini is thinking, look at this woman, everything is covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture, because from her perspective, the only reason that such an outfit would exist is because there's male domination that's forcing it, right? The woman on the right says, oh, nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture, saying look, she has to flaunt herself as an object of sexuality. She's judged solely based on her body and her looks. You would only do that in a male-dominated society because of males, right? Now, there may be some truth and some inaccuracies on both sides, but they're both judging this from their own perspectives, and there's a history behind it for both of them, right? The blonde woman in the bikini is coming probably from a perspective where there were women's rights struggles for decades, well, for centuries really, but like throughout the 20th and let's say like including like women's suffrage, and sort of the 20s flapper movements and the sexual revolution, in order to cast off the chains of, say, like Victorian society, where women were used solely for reproduction and weren't expected to have any desires of their own, right? So that's liberation. This outfit is liberation from her perspective. Perhaps from the other perspective, the full sort of niqab outfit is a way of ensuring that you aren't judged solely by your looks, and also a way to be respectful to your culture and your religious beliefs. And it's a way of preserving dignity, and actually in today's day and age, I believe this cartoon was created probably in the earlier 2000s, but in today's day and age, you might even say wearing sort of a full body covering like that might even be a way to reaffirm your identity and your beliefs in the face of discrimination or people who don't understand where that comes from. So it really could be a type of resistance in today's day and age. But you wouldn't know that if you didn't stop to consider the history, if you didn't ask her why. Why do you do this? Why do you think what I do is strange? If you don't learn the history, if you don't read the scriptures, if you don't ask people why they do what they do, if you don't see how this connects to something else in society, how gender roles and religion and economics and history are all intertwined, then you'll never understand. Then we're stuck at an impasse where I think you are absolutely wrong and you think I'm absolutely wrong, and we don't even attempt to understand. Okay? So cultural relativism is a method, it's a tool to gain understanding, cultural logic and context. You suspend your judgment to the extent possible, long enough to understand, to learn. It's sort of like walk a mile in someone's shoes, but it's more like walk a mile in another culture's shoes, in a sense. It means assuming, at least at the outset, that when we're talking that humans are humans are humans are humans. Yes, nobody's perfect, and yes, there are some people who are more antisocial and more destructive and selfish than others. But in general, people are people, right? And it's not like there's some different species out there. And in general, we are all formed by our biology and our culture, which means our experiences, our interactions, and our common sense, and so forth, right? So, starting from that perspective, you operate from the assumption that all cultures have reasons why they do what they do. Doesn't mean you have to agree with it. Doesn't mean you have to find it appealing. But what it means is start from an assumption, rather than assuming your way is the only way, start from an assumption that you do things the way you do things because of certain reasons, some of which you can't articulate, and they do things the way they do things also for certain reasons, some of which they can't articulate. But understanding them helps to bridge some of that, right? So what it means again is not immediately saying like that there's a binary of good or bad, rational or irrational, smart and stupid, primitive and advanced. That you don't need any kind of you don't need it, if that's how you approach the world. You don't need to be in this class. No one has to teach you anything, right? Because all you need is your own assumptions, and that's it. You know. Now, moral relativism, on the other hand, is not a tool. It's a viewpoint. It's a worldview. It's a philosophy. Pseudo-nihilistic, existentialist, as in, there's no absolute right or wrong. It's impossible. So everything is equally valid or equally invalid. So murder in whatever circumstances, who am I to say it's wrong? Anything you can think of, right? Because there is no morality, there are no ethics, which also means there's no responsibility to try to create change or to intervene to make things better. Right? That is not what anthropology supports, or that's not part of our toolkit. That is a worldview. That is a philosophy. That's not a science. Okay. Cultural relativism is a tool. It's an approach in order to try to understand. Okay. Moral relativism is a belief. Okay. So it's like studying religions of the world, where you're learning about them and their histories. Doesn't mean you're every religion in the world, right? It just means you're trying to learn how they came to be, what they have in common, what's different, why it's different. That's sort of cultural relativism. Okay, moral relativism would be saying, well, they're all dumb, none of them know anything, or they're all equally valid, so whatever. But that has nothing to do with social science or science in general. That's just a belief, okay? So please don't confuse it. Forget that term, even, because that's not part of anthropology. What is part of anthropology is cultural relativism, a tool, an approach, in order to try to understand. And remember, understanding does not mean condoning. Okay? So that's it. Sorry for the rambling. Hopefully you found some of that informative. And I'll be in touch. Have a good day. Have a good night. Have a good afternoon. Have a good nap. Have a good shower. Have a good meal. And I'll see you later.